story. This happened in December of 2015. I was 16 years old at the time, and my depression was once again taking a dip for the worst. Despite this, and despite the toxicity of my relationship at the time, I did my best to talk with my family about the holidays. I don't have the best relationship with them since I'm usually a quiet person around them, but on that month, both my parents told me something curious. The first account came from my dad. He told me that a few months before December, he had been driving home at around 8 p.m., so everything was dark, and the streets were barely lit with lampposts. The neighborhood I live in is a quiet one, but we have very few lampposts in our street, so walking outside at night can feel really creepy. There are neighbors who own dogs, large ones, but they're almost always quiet too. So my dad was driving down the street, and as he turned onto our street, he said he saw something in the middle of the road. He had trouble making out what it was, but he described it as a large black dog. He said it was really furry and that its ears were upright, but when I asked if it was just a stray dog, he looked at me wide-eyed and shook his head. He said this dog was abnormally huge, bigger than any other dog he had ever seen. Its eyes were piercing through him as he continued to drive, but as my dad came closer to the dog, it stepped out of view. My dad had never spoken about it until about a week ago, and even then he hadn't actually told me about it before. The only person he had told was my mother. My mom is very afraid of black dogs because of an incident from her childhood, so when I asked her about my dad's experience a few days after, she told me she froze slightly and admitted that she had seen it too. Her experience was very similar to that of my dad's. They were both coming home late at night. She had just come back from working out at the gym when she said she saw a huge black dog on the sidewalk. She, however, asked me if I knew if any of the neighbors had any black dogs, as I tend to walk around more and greet the neighbors' dogs if they're friendly. I told her that there was one, but it was just a black lab. It was a medium size and chubby, far from the description that my parents had given me. When I told her, she looked at me frightened and asked that I look into it. She's a very superstitious woman, while I tend to rationalize situations more. Maybe that's why this scares me so much. About a week after, she came up to me again, terrified. She asked me if I had ever looked into the black dog. I told her I had, and that I only remember the American version of the black dog, that if you see it once, it means joy, and if you see it twice, it means sorrow. I never told her about the third part, though, as I knew she would go ballistic if she knew. From what I read, if you see the dog a third time, it means death. Anyways, when I asked her why, she told me this. The day prior to her asking me, she went to a Christmas party with a few friends, and one friend had offered to help her bring back some food home, as the rest couldn't. It was soup. After her friend had helped her, she was going back to her car when she suddenly called my mom. My mom answered, and her friend was already driving away from our house, but in the middle of the conversation, she abruptly asked if we had let our dog outside. We do have a dog. She's a tiny white Maltese, and we love her to death, but we don't let her outside as she was never fully trained. My dog asked, "What dog?" To which her friend said, "There was a black dog on your doorstep. It was sniffing the door and looked like it wanted to go inside, but it was a really big dog. Was it yours?" My mom didn't want to scare her friend, so she told her that it was probably just a stray. But my mom had the feeling that it was the same black dog that she and my dad had seen. I didn't know what that meant, with the dog being on our doorstep and all, but I later put the pieces together, and here's why this scares me. On the 22nd of December, I had attempted suicide. I won't go into too much detail as to what pushed me to attempt suicide, but it did come from both depression and the state of my relationship as a whole. I was very, very close to dying and never told anyone in my family. I don't think I ever will. When I asked her when she saw the black dog, she told me she saw it on the 21st of December. The second she told me, I felt a huge pit form in my stomach. I did my best to hide my horrified expression. I kept saying to myself that this has to be a coincidence. There is no way that that black dog had anything to do with me nearly dying. But looking back on it now, it is a really strange coincidence. It's a full year later. I'm 17 years old and doing much better than I was last year. I only remember the story because yesterday was the 22nd of December. I still don't know what to think. about 6 months ago. For some background, I grew up in a religious household, which means my family believes in the supernatural. Spirits, angels, God, the devil, we believe it. My parents have told me stories, and I have my own stories with dealing with the supernatural growing up. I could see things when I was young, and as I grew up every now and then, I would see something in the house. I also have stories of sleep paralysis, astral projection, and lucid dreaming if you're interested in hearing about those another time. Now, on Christmas of 2015, my then fiance bought me a huge panda bear that was almost as tall as me. I loved it and slept with it in my bed. After we got married and I moved into his apartment, there wasn't much room for the panda, so we placed it into the storage closet. Now, what happened this day is something that has not happened to me in over a decade. After moving in, I kept feeling weird sleeping in the bedroom, especially when by myself. I always got that strong sensation that something or someone was watching me. I just brushed it off because I figured that the feeling was being in a new place. When this night my husband woke up out of the blue and saw me shaking as if though I was moseying on down there was no big deal to him at all. But only after having lived in Shadron for around 7 months, the man whose colleagues said was of astounding intelligence appeared to vanish into thin air. He stopped showing up to his scheduled lectures, stopped getting in touch with friends, and those that were used to seeing him striding to and from the state college remarked that they hadn't seen him in a while. He was reported missing to local police, who immediately began an investigation into his whereabouts. They discovered that he had attended a Christmas party on December 2nd, 2006, and those that had seen and talked to him at the party reported that he had seemed in remarkably good spirits. A neighbor had then seen him leaving his apartment at around 10 p.m. on December 4th, after which police were able to trace his movements to a local ATM where he withdrew $100 before walking down to the state college, where he apparently logged onto the computer system at exactly 11:41 p.m. After this, he simply dropped off the face of the earth. He didn't return to his apartment, and there were no more sightings of him around Shadron. It took until March 9th of the following year to find Stephen, when 2 ranchers walking through the nearby hills came across him. What they saw horrified them. Stephen was dead, his body bound by the wrists and ankles so hard that the thin ropes had cut into his flesh. What's more, he had been set alight. The ranchers found a blackened, charred corpse that had been stripped of its clothing. An official autopsy determined that Stephen had died of smoke and soot inhalation, along with a series of really painful thermal injuries. Accelerant was found on his corpse, and a nearly empty bottle of peppermint schnapps was found close to where he lay. There were no signs of a struggle, nor any indication that there had been any additional people there with Hataya when he died. The local newspaper interviewed Mike Bloom, one of the ranchers who had found his body, quoting him as saying, "When you see something like that, somebody in that kind of condition, you just hope that they catch whoever did it." Local police were quickly subjected to some pretty heavy criticism from the local townsfolk, who asked why they hadn't done more to find the gregarious math professor that many had come to know and love. After a month of silence from the authorities, police admitted that they should have acted faster, acknowledging that their investigation had noted that Stephen had been talked about leaving Shadron, and seemed perfectly happy with his life there. "We could have searched those remote areas for days and days and days, but where do you start?" said acting Shadron Police Chief Margaret Kuiper. Without any concrete answers regarding his death, intense speculation over the nature of Stephen's death drove the citizens of Shadron into a near frenzy. Kent Reeves, who worked across the street from Stephen's apartment and was one of those who regularly saw him walking to and from the state college, admitted that things had gotten a little crazy, going on to say that some people are really freaked out over this. Like, was he just randomly picked up, or was there a reason he was killed in such a way? In the aftermath of the frightening revelations surrounding Stephen's death, former city councilman Morgan Mueller, along with several other prominent figures, said that they worried that Hataya was the victim of some kind of hate crime. One of Stephen's students, Kellen Cars, said that they and a handful of their classmates had been theorizing that Stephen had been deliberately targeted due to his apparently effeminate mannerisms. There have been several rumors floating around town which centered around Stephen's orientation, but a man named Tim Sorensen, Stephen's best friend in Chadron, strongly asserted that he was not gay. He knew Stephen very well by the time he disappeared and insisted that if anyone knew of any alternative lifestyle that Stephen was living, it would be him. Local police refused to comment or speculate on the idea that Stephen's death had been a homophobic hate crime, but in spite of the fact that Stephen was found bound and buried, others have suggested that, unbelievably, the cause of death might actually be him taking his own life. Stephen was once hospitalized for severe depression, a mental illness so severe that he apparently lost the ability to look after himself. It is believed that part of the reason he made the move to rural Nebraska was to escape his demons, but that throughout the process of carving out a life for himself there, said demons caught up with him, and he was overwhelmed by these ideations. It is then that he decided to walk up into the hills surrounding the city to take his own life, but it is a matter of record that it most definitely would not have been easy for the 46-year-old to make the solo journey up into the wild rolling hills where his body was found. Stephen was ice skating in March of 2005 when a nasty fall caused him to suffer a broken hip. The experience made him extremely cautious, and despite him apparently walking everywhere, Tim Sorensen testified that he tended to avoid walking on bumpy sidewalks and would navigate around objects more than a couple of feet tall, instead of trying to step over them. So the idea of him deciding to take the risk of walking the rough terrain of the hills is extremely dubious. "This is the most mysterious thing that's ever happened here," said Con Marshall, a lifelong area resident who has worked at Chadron State College for 38 years. Other professors who worked alongside Stephen said that he didn't seem in the least bit depressed or anxious in the run-up to his disappearance, stating that their colleague was excited for the future and was enjoying his new life in Chadron. Phil Carey, Stephen's assistant professor, said that he wasn't one to isolate himself or obsess over his work, and that Stephen was in such good spirits around the time that he vanished that there was no way he would have guessed that he had a history of depression or mental illness. "I know a person can hide depression, but I didn't see any of it," Carey was quoted as saying by a local news publication. Carey said Stephen had a dry sense of humor, but was otherwise very sociable and enjoyed light-hearted conversation on a plethora of different subjects. He also cared a great deal about his students and was constantly trying to find more effective ways of teaching and explaining mathematical concepts to them. Stephen apparently enjoyed his new job a great deal and immersed himself in all its facets, often working late into the night, as is evidenced by him logging onto the college computer network a short while before midnight. As local police forces floundered in their attempts to get a break in the case, they handed over responsibility to the Nebraska State Patrol, who could devote considerable more time and resources into the investigation. Loren Zimmerman, a retired Los Angeles police detective turned criminal justice professor, was one of Stephen's colleagues over at Chadron State College, and they took a great deal of interest in the case, having gone as far as beginning his own semi-professional investigation into the case. Zimmerman was quoted as saying that he was confident that state agents could solve the case, but it's going to take a little bit of work. Perhaps one of the darker theories surrounding Stephen's death is that he had indeed been hiding his alternative lifestyle, and it was the pursuit of this gratification that got him killed. Some post the idea that bigoted members of the Chadron community had long suspected Stephen of being gay and had set up a kind of sting operation to discover whether or not he actually was. As the theory goes, Stephen was lured into the hills surrounding Chadron by someone posing as a romantic interest. When they heard and confirmed that Stephen wished to engage in these intimate acts, he was ambushed by people who were lying in wait, where he was then bound, tortured, and then set on fire. For some, the insistence by those in authority that his death was in fact him taking his life is evidence that there is some greater conspiracy at work. How could a church writing letters to the Pope and Cardinal Keith O'Brien and attending a central Edinburgh church? She also had a tattoo of the Virgin Mary on one arm and one of the devil on the other, claimed at the trial that the Archangel Saint Michael had taken over her body and used her as an instrument of God to punish the unclean demon. While passing this sentence, the judge told Melissa, having murdered him, you set about trying to persuade health professionals that you were suffering. For Dayton, Ohio, Christmas time of 1992 would become synonymous with a group whose name would haunt the city for many years to come, the Downtown Posse. What began as an itch for easy cash somehow morphed into some of the most bloodthirsty killing sprees in Ohio's history. And the one who did it got little more than a couple of dollars, some jewelry, and a pair of gym shoes. Since they met during a night of drinking just 2 weeks prior, 20-year-old Marvelous Keene and his 16-year-old girlfriend, Laura Taylor, had been inseparable. Their whirlwind romance had been intense, but it has also been expensive. Laura had recently been kicked out of her parents' house after an intense argument stemming from her poor behavior. She had no job and had quickly become financially dependent on Marvelous, who had burned through what little cash she had keeping her entertained. In the 2 weeks before Christmas, they had spent the last of their cash on a single-night stay in a downtown Dayton hotel, and they were desperate for more. But that night, Laura had an idea of how they would make some fast cash. She knew of a man named Joseph Wilkerson, who had a rather lucrative job at a General Motors, a man who spent a sizable amount of his disposable income on deviancy, and the plan was simple. Laura would call Joseph and invite him to an adult party that involved debauchery and revelry in exchange for a sizable amount of cash. Once they knew he had the cash on hand, they would get into his home with the help of a fellow member of the Downtown Posse, Heather Matthews, and rob him. But the raid turned into something far more horrific than a simple smash and grab. On Christmas Eve, once Marvelous, Heather, and Laura had forced their way into Joseph's home at 3321 Prescott Avenue, they tied him to his bed with an electrical cord, torturing him until he gave up the cash. But once the money was secured, Marvelous used a .32 caliber Derringer to execute their victims so that he couldn't report them to the police. After the murder had been committed, the trio made themselves at home, raiding Joseph's fridge and playing loud music, before stealing his car, which facilitated their killing spree. From that point, it was like a group of sharks smelling blood in the water, and the Downtown Posse began a frenzy of violence. The next victim was Danita Goulet, who was shot multiple times while using a payphone at 517 Neal Avenue. There was no plan this time. It seemed they just shot a total random person in the middle of the street before jumping out of the stolen car and taking her shoes, jacket, and backpack. After they were apprehended by police, the surviving members of the Downtown Posse would... During college Christmas break of 2016, I had traveled all the way back to Pennsylvania from California to spend the holidays with my parents. It was kind of weird going from being a mostly independent college kid in a place that hardly ever gets cold, to going back to living in my childhood bedroom in a state that becomes a legit winter wonderland around December and January. But I love my mom and dad, and I don't care how much the flight costs. There was no way I was going to spend the holidays alone in Cali. So anyway, my old room is on the second floor of the house, directly above the sliding door that heads out onto the decking in our backyard. It's a really heavy door, so anytime someone opens or closes it, it rumbles right up into my bedroom. This was in a house that was built back in the 50s too, so as you can imagine, the whole place has a lot of creaks and groans to it, but is otherwise pretty sturdy. I should also add at this point that part of the town that my parents live at is pretty safe, with a relatively low crime rate, especially to that of nearby Philly. The most intrusive calls they ever got tended to be from magazine salespeople and the odd Jehovah's Witnesses, and after my dad insisted on debating scripture with them, they stopped calling altogether. Point being, they never had anything remotely close to any kind of break-in or home invasion for the entire time they were living in that property. Next thing is a brief confession for myself here. I picked up a pretty horrible smoking habit during my freshman year of college, so whenever my parents went to bed, I tended to stay up late playing Civ on my laptop, sitting next to my open bedroom window while I smoked and drank tumblers of scotch that I'd pilfered from my dad's liquor cabinet. After midnight, I'd have my window open from anything of 30 minutes to 2 hours. I mean, it would purely depend on how cold it was outside or how tired I was, but I generally let the room air out before spraying some air freshener so that the tobacco smell didn't cling to anything too bad. I also had to use headphones to watch TV and listen to music so it wouldn't wake my mom and dad up. But I tend to only ever use one earphone so I could keep an ear out for anyone coming down the hallway, since they really wouldn't be happy if they found I was smoking in the house. So one night, I was in my usual routine of conquering the known world in an online multiplayer game of Civ when our house alarm suddenly starts blaring. I don't think I'd heard that thing since I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I had completely forgotten about how loud it was. So hearing it had me practically filling my underwear from being frightened out of my skin. Point being, everyone in the house is now wide awake and ready to head off whatever is about to go down. Now my priorities might sound way off here, but initially my big worry wasn't so much that something bad might be happening, like a home invasion or something like that. It was more like me being terrified that my parents were about to realize I've been smoking and stealing booze from them. I was 20 years old at the time, technically underage, and my parents were old-fashioned types, real sticklers for the rules. If they found out what I'd been doing, there'd be drama, and lots of it. But somehow, when my dad stuck his head around my door all bleary-eyed to make sure he knew where I was, he didn't seem to smell anything. I don't know whether this was because he was too tired and freaked out about the alarms to notice, or that he noticed and actually just didn't care, but either way, he told me to go into their bedroom and stay with my mom until he'd give us the all clear. So my dad goes downstairs, I'm assuming with pistol in hand, and gets to work clearing the house, as well as checking the front and backyards to make sure that there's no one hiding in the darker areas out there. He comes back up, tells me and my mom he couldn't find anything and it was probably just a false alarm, and then we all head back to bed. Or rather, they went back to bed. I just went back to being a diplomatic genius on Civ 6. About an hour goes by and I start getting pretty tired, so I get up to close my bedroom window before heading to bed when the alarm goes off again. Once again, my dad goes downstairs, does a sweep of the grounds floor and the yards, then comes back to tell me not to worry, that he figured it was just the wind or something. I mean, it had been a pretty windy night, which honestly suited me because it meant the breeze aired my room out. Like I said, it was an old house, so it wasn't out of the question that the wind could have rattled the doors or windows and set the alarm off. The point being that both me and my dad were chill about the alarm going off. Neither of us thought that there was anything to worry about. So the next morning at breakfast, my dad is going through the alarm system's app on his iPhone, checking out some of the data readouts from the night before. All of a sudden, he's all like, okay, that's weird. Apparently the backsliding doors were open 14 times last night.
So this is like a max security prison. It's like a pretty intense prison. Like, if you like mess around in this prison, they'll send you to like that really intense prison in Colorado where like El Chapo is. Like, so like if you like get to this prison, I'm pretty sure it's pretty serious. And then that other prison we just passed, I don't know if you could even see it that well on the video because it was so foggy. That's more of like a mental health type of prison. Like this is like a max security in Waymart, and there's been like a murder there, and like someone got sent to that like supermax prison in Colorado. So that's why I said what I said earlier about like not messing around at that prison, because it's like already happened in the past, like a while ago. I don't remember the guy's name, but it was some like murderer from like down south, but it wasn't like anything local. Like it was like a local prison guard who died, but it wasn't like a local fugitive or whatever. And right now I'm kind of just waiting for the fog to clear up.
Number one, I was impressed the alarm system was so sophisticated that it could feed him that kind of info. I guess
the reason why I'm waiting for the fog to clear up is because there's like a place that should be pretty good for hiking. It's very close, and it's like in the fog area, unfortunately.
shelled out big boy cash for that thing. But number two, how could it have been opened that many times? Then I'm not kidding, like
I'm sure
5 to 10 minutes later, there's a knock at our front door. And it's the neighbor guy from the house down the street. He asked us if we had any intruders over the previous night, and we tell him no, or that at least we didn't think so. It's then that he tells us that he actually caught someone on a security camera trying to break into his house, that the dude had tried to jimmy a lock or something before looking right up into the camera before getting spooked and bailing. We assume that this is about the time that he moved on to our house, then kept at it when he realized it was the weaker target. That seriously freaked me out. The whole time I've been sitting there, innocently playing games, sipping stolen scotch, there had been a guy trying to get into our house, maybe only 6 or 7 feet below me. If I'd have bothered to look out the window at any point directly downward, I'd have locked eyes with the guy. He must have smelled my cigarette smoke, known someone was home, and it just didn't bother him in the least bit. He was more than prepared to face off with someone, although apparently not when he'd seen my dad with his pistol, sweeping the house and yards in the dark. I've always liked a scary story or a good horror film. Ghosts, vampires, werewolves, they're my jam. I've never found, like, serial killers or whatever to be that scary, though. Like, I didn't think that the human element to the horror was particularly potent. After that night, though, that all changed. It struck me how evil and predatory human beings can really be. How that guy had been creeping around in our backyard for basically hours right under my nose, and I had absolutely no clue he was there. It's how he managed to just disappear when the alarm went off, too, and how he had the balls to come back once we'd all gone back to bed. I mean, he was like a ghost or something, just vanishing into the darkness. I mean, think about it. My dad had checked out the backyard, tried to make sure that there was no one hanging around, hiding out in the dark spots underneath the trees, and there had been someone there, just watching my dad walking around in his slippers or whatever he had on, just waiting for him to call off the search before creeping back up towards the house. Just thinking about it now gives me shivers. And now that I'm back in Cali writing this, I always make sure that all the windows and doors in my dorm are locked, and that I double or triple check whenever I think something bad is about to go down or whatever. Because sometimes it seems you'll never know if someone is just lurking in the shadows until it's way, way too late. Woke with him in the back entrance. One time I asked him what his secret was. He looked me square in the eyes with this intense stare, which, mind you, he was still dressed as Santa, so it was somewhere between being hard to take serious and also hard not just to shrug off. Drugs, he said flatly. Then he held the look just long enough to make it extremely awkward. Finally, he burst into laughter. It was hard not to laugh with him. The guy had one heck of a sense of humor. So one day, he pulls a no-call knife show. I get in and everyone is freaking out. Usually nobody cared all that much as we all got to go home, but seeing as it was Christmas in a few days, this was when the profit was at its height. Messing with this was not to be taken lightly. 10 minutes into me showing up and they decided I should take the role. I wasn't that old, however, I was pretty fat at the time. I put up an argument, but in the end, it was do it or get fired. I tried to convince myself that impressing the hot lady I mentioned earlier would make it worthwhile, but when that first kid crawled on my lap and told me that she wanted to... About 3 hours into doing this, I noticed a strange man sitting in the food court. He looked older, like his skin was leathery. He looked like he's been in a few fights, too. He was looking right at me. I'm not talking about a bypassing glance either, no. This guy was giving me the stink eye. I tried to ignore him, figuring he'd just go away after a while, but the guy just stayed right there. He wouldn't stop staring at me. I wanted to point this guy out to my coworker, thinking that they could call security, but then I started to let the possible repercussions snowball in my head. If he realized what I did, just walked away to another location. But in case you're not, I'll give you the quick version. Everyone is assigned a random coworker to secretly give a gift to. Usually there's something like a price cap around $15 or so. I really need to spell it out for you readers. The events of this story happened several years ago. During the course of that year, I lived overseas. My company had a branch in Europe, and I decided I would work there for a year or so. For the most part, it was beautiful, and I had a really great time, learning the culture and meeting new people. But during the holiday time, especially around Christmas, it could get very lonely and made me homesick. My family and friends still lived back in the United States and could not afford to come see me, and because of my job, I was stuck in Europe for the time being. On Christmas, I stayed home in my apartment and decided to watch movies. After watching Netflix for a couple of hours, I got bored, and I was looking for something to entertain me for a while. Quick backstory about me: when I was in high school, my friends and I used to crack the surface of the so-called dark web, or deep web. We were all pretty computer savvy and thought we were cool being able to access it at a young age. We didn't do anything besides just surf around, as we were scared to stumble across something we shouldn't. Well, fast forward back to the present, and I haven't done anything like that in close to 10 years. But I decided searching the dark web was just the excitement I was looking for on this quiet Christmas evening. It's honestly seemed pretty harmless, and I thought, what could go wrong? I searched through dozens of dead-end links and pages, and nothing really seemed to spark my interest. After an hour or so of surfing, I decided it was finally time for bed. I closed everything down on my computer and went to the bathroom. When I came out, I noticed my webcam screen was up. Being a little naive, I didn't think anything of it and just closed it out. As I turned away, it popped up again. As I stood and watched for several seconds trying to comprehend what was happening, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from a private number that said, "I see you." Beyond creeped out and starting to get worried, I decided to shut off my lights and turn the computer off. But before I could, I had an email pop up on my desktop. The email was a picture of my apartment building. I unplugged my computer and grabbed a knife from my kitchen and stood in the corner of my apartment. Almost immediately after unplugging the computer, another text came through that said, "I hope your doors are locked." I couldn't comprehend what was happening. I was frozen in both shock and fear. All I could think of was something happened while I was on the dark web, and I wasn't sure what. For hours, I stood in my dark apartment staring at the windows and doors. Every little noise made me jump out of my skin. Every time I heard somebody in the hall, I was getting myself ready for self-defense. Now, this was Christmas night, and the middle of the night at this point. There was no way there should be that much foot traffic in the hallway, but I heard it. Back and forth, I heard footsteps all night long, but never anybody actually standing in front of or knocking at my door. Morning finally came, and I still had not slept, and hardly moved all night. At about 8:30, somebody knocked on my door. I slowly approached the door, not knowing at all what to expect. As I looked through the people, I noticed it was my neighbor. I opened the door and greeted him. "I hope you had a Merry Christmas," he said to me in an almost excited voice. I just nodded and said, "You too." In his cheerful morning voice, he then said, "Somebody dropped this letter off to me this morning and said it was for you. They said they couldn't talk to you for some reason." I took the letter, knowing deep down where it truly came from. I asked, "What did he look like?" And he responded with, "Well, he was actually a she. She was pretty, dark hair, smile." I said thanks and shut the door. Standing right there, I opened the letter. It was a Christmas card with Santa on the front, and the inside of the card was written as follows. It started with my name, my full name, and then read as followed. "I hope you had a nice Christmas. I am sad you never came out in the hall to meet me and my friends. I guess there is always next year. Happy Christmas." I left right at that moment. I grabbed the few things I needed and checked into a hotel. I stayed a couple of nights and returned back to the States and told my bosses I was having some sort of medical emergency and that I felt more comfortable finishing out my contract in the States. I never contacted the police and have also never been so scared in my entire life. Every single time I get on the internet, I get a little shaky and I use it for my job and not personal use. Nothing like this has happened to me again in the years since, and thankfully, no follow-ups to this single occurrence. I still can't help but wonder and she is my entire life. The day of these events, my husband was at work, so I decided to do some Christmas shopping at the mall. On the way in, Jennifer saw Santa sitting in the middle of the atrium and began jumping because I assumed she associated Santa with presents. We decided to get it because I thought I was having a seizure. He was going to call 911 when I woke up, sat right up, and gasped. I see a white hooded figure standing over him on the right side of the bed, peeking at us. My heart is bursting out of my chest. It's been a long time since I've seen an entity. He asked what was wrong. I said there's something looking at us. He turns to look in front of our bed where the TV stand is. Could sleep the rest of the night. We stayed up discussing what he saw and what I saw. But what I saw was a white hooded figure. His was a black hooded figure crouching on the table. The next morning he says, "Do you think the panda had something to do with it? Because I get an eerie feeling when I walk past it." I tell him I feel the same way whenever I look at it too. Even our dog barks at it and tries to attack it. We contemplated the whole day on whether or not we should throw it out. So the following day he goes to work and I'm alone with the dogs. I decide to cleanse the house using the anointing oil my parents gave me and pray. Every time I walk past the closet with the panda and say Jesus, my whole body would get cold and I would have shivers and goosebumps all over. I called my husband and told him what happened, and when he came home he threw it out. It felt a little better in the apartment, but not too long after things started happening again. So I had my dad come over and pray, and things were much better after that. So for almost 2 weeks things were calm. Our upstairs neighbor is a strange woman who never leaves her house and hardly sleeps. I can hear her around 1 a.m. moving stuff and walking around every single night. I always get weird vibes from her. But anyway, when my husband first moved in, she gave us some groceries. Fast forward to a few days after my dad comes and prays, she gives us a chew toy and snacks for our dogs. Shortly afterwards, that feeling of being watched returned. And that night, I had just dozed off when I felt the bed shaking. I look at my husband, and he's shaking just like I was in the previous incidents. I look over by our closed bedroom door, and this humanoid creature is crawling on the ceiling, trying to hide in the darkness of the corner. It was hard to make out, but I knew it was a grayish dark color and had some type of small horns. I didn't know what to do at this point. I'm not as spiritually strong as my parents, so just praying wouldn't be good enough. I turned on a song called Jesus, 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 and put it on low and repeat and was able to fall back asleep. I've long thought it had something to do with whatever my neighbor is into. It's usually the same time she wakes in the early AM, so when I get that eerie feeling of being watched. Something I also noticed between these two incidences is that I always lucid dream, meaning I know that I'm dreaming and can manipulate my dreams and even sometimes drag them out longer when I want. I've been doing this since I was around 8 years old. I also always remember them when I wake up. During these two occurrences, I didn't lucid dream and believed what was going on was actually reality. Plus, after waking up, I couldn't remember what happened in them. It felt as whatever that spirit is was implanting those dreams in my head. I threw out the dog toy and had both my parents come back and pray and do a cleansing with the oil. Now, every now and then, if I don't pray throughout the house, that feeling comes back, and I see shadows move out of the corner of my eye. So I have to constantly pray and anoint the house every few weeks. Our lease is up in April, and hopefully, we can move by then. This happened on Christmas Eve, just about a year ago. I was visiting my family on my stepdad's side with my biological mother, and after most of my relatives had left, I found myself with a photo book in my lap. My mother, myself, and my stepdad's father were sitting around looking at photos. There was a picture of this one woman with dark brown hair that struck me as familiar. I remembered her as a child. I vividly remember her leaning down and speaking to me, asking me how it was, etc. I also remember that she worked at a Gallahan's gas station, as I had seen her numerous times when my stepdads would go in and buy cigarettes. As I had recalled this to my stepdad's dad, he looked at me with an expression of complete confusion and maybe then fear. He told me that I was correct about where she had worked, but it had been nowhere near where we lived. He also told me there was no way I would ever have known her, considering the fact that she died of a brain aneurysm in his bathtub back in 1993. I'm 16 now, meaning I was born 8 years afterwards. There would have been no way of meeting her, but apart from the fact that this woman died in his bathtub, in the same house we were sitting in, what still chills me to the bone and makes me wonder is how I had known exactly where she had worked, and why had I seen her as a small child. I go to an all-girls boarding school. There are 9 junior and 4 senior boarding houses. The junior houses are for girls between 11 to 16, and the senior houses are for girls 16 to 18. At the beginning of September 2016, I moved out of my junior house into my new senior house, which, for the sake of not bringing my school into this, we'll call Robinson. Robinson was different from the other houses in that you only stayed for a year, but that you stayed with another person in a double room, as opposed to the single rooms like other senior boarding houses, and I chose to share with my best friend, Georgia. For various reasons, I ended up going back to school 2 days early with only a handful of other girls. I get told to go to my room, and I discover that it's in the basement of the house, tucked into a corner with 2 other rooms. The minute I was in the room, I felt something was off, like really, really off. It was like there was this nasty aura in the room, like I wasn't alone in the room. I'm really into ghost stories and the paranormal, so all those stories started to kick in. That being said, I have pretty bad anxiety, so I told myself it was that and tried to ignore it. I unpacked, and since Georgia isn't there yet, I get to pick which one of the beds, which desk, and which drawers I want. I chose one that's on the far side of the room, with the end facing the open doorway that leads to the space where you can either turn right and go to the toilet, or go left and go to the door to the rest of the house. This room is absolutely huge, so I can space out my stuff, and I'm pretty happy about it. At about 9, I decide that enough's enough and I should go to sleep. I turn the main lights out and get into bed and try to go to sleep and pull the duvet over my head. I then proceed to spend the next 5 hours absolutely terrified. That feeling that something's in the room is amplified 1,000 times, and it's made worse by the fact that I can hear things, shuffling in the dark, soft scratching on the carpet, and creaks of people sitting on wood. I'm absolutely sure that I have heard someone breathing near my head at some point during the night. I'm so terrified that I have to psych myself up to even change position, sure that something will jump onto me. I'm exhausted in the morning, and when I finally woke up, I realized that although it's not as strong or as powerful as during the night, the feeling that something is in the room with me is still there. It's awful, like something is hanging onto my back, waiting for me to turn my back so it can jump at me. My roommate comes back about 3 days later, and I notice she hardly seems to notice the atmosphere in the room, which seems so painfully obvious to me, and happily puts away all of her stuff. That feeling that there's something in the room was honestly terrifying. I couldn't study in silence. I had to have music on so that I could attempt to block out this feeling. And I always left my phone on with YouTube videos playing when I had to go to the toilet, just to make me feel like if I came back out into the room, I wouldn't have to see something standing in the room, silently waiting for me. It sounds really stupid, but it was the only way I could reassure myself. The feeling that I was being watched was always most clearer at night. It's probably because I was on my own and didn't have anything else to do but try and go to sleep. For whatever reason, it genuinely scared me. I've asked in other rooms in the house. There are 4 floors in total, including the basement, and been into other rooms, and it feels like a nice normal room, and nobody in them ever felt like they were ever being watched. The worst place where it happened was the open doorway, the one my bed faces. In the beginning, it was easy to ignore. The feeling of being watched only happening every now and then. But as time went on, it got worse and worse. At the worst, it felt as though a grown man was standing at the doorway, barring the way, staring at my bed, and it was as though I could physically feel the presence there.
It's like the worst road I've been on
One
in a long time.
It was particularly bad. I tried to shrug it off and get to sleep. I had the habit of bringing up one leg to my chest for a bit and then bringing it back down. That night, I brought my leg up, felt the presence, rushed it
I would be better off if it was just like a dirt road. Like that's just like a nasty road. It's like literally
I
pointless.
felt the edge of the mattress sink downwards, as though somebody had suddenly sat on it. headphones couldn't make out what she was saying. Anyways, Georgia makes some point, and I couldn't hear what she said, so I turned over from my position of facing the wall and lift up the duvet to face her bed. I lift my head, and I see a dark shadow above her desk of drawers, floating above the book she has on top of it. We had the curtains open, so a shriek of light from a street lamp was shining through the window into our room, since our windows open out into the car park. And in it, I could see the shadows in the shape of a head and shoulders, with the head facing the window, all in pitch dark shadow, so I couldn't make out any features but what seemed to be a prominent Roman nose. I freaked out, yanked the duvet over my head and faced the wall. It felt wrong, like something that shouldn't be there. It really set me off, and since then I got really wary of something actually being in the room. And there are two other incidences that occurred and convinced it for me that something was in the room. The first was when I was under my desk, looking for some socks to wear to dinner, and as I dragged myself out of the desk, I reached behind me for my jumper and glanced to see where I was. And as I did, I got a glimpse of a light blue woolen peacoat standing directly behind me, just above my shoulder, so close that I saw the way the light glinted in the buttons, and I could only make out just that the arms of the coat were inside the pockets. I stood up as fast as I could, and I saw that the coat, and presumably the wearer, had vanished. I didn't even hesitate and just legged it out of the place, and refused to go back in for another hour until I knew that my roommate was back in the house. The worst incident was also the last. It was Sunday morning, and we were allowed lie-ins. I was asleep, and suddenly I became aware of the fact that I was asleep and lying in bed. I suppose it's what you could call a lucid dream, but I'm not sure as it's never actually happened to me before. I didn't have enough time to focus on it because next thing I knew, there was a feeling of something being near me, and then a feeling that something was by my head, and I felt a presence standing by my head, leaning over me, so solid that it felt like another human being was right there, even through the fog of my sleeping mind. I didn't have enough time to realize what was happening until I felt a hand, a solid, warm human hand, touch my head and the bit just under my ears and start to stroke it. And I swear to Christ and back again that a voice began to make a noise in my ear, like a weird moaning sound, or like someone was sobbing with their mouth closed, muffling the sounds of sobs. I wasn't sure if it was real, but I sure wasn't taking any chances if it wasn't a dream, so I twisted myself away from it and screamed out loud, "Georgia! Georgia!" Georgia bolted out and looked around as I tore my covers off and looked around my area. She looked really confused, as though she hadn't seen anything, and I thought that maybe it had been a dream, until I noticed that my wall calendar that was pinned up to my notice board above my head had been ripped off the wall and was lying on the floor by my bed, despite the fact that it was definitely pinned up securely the night before. It never got as bad as that again. The feeling of being watched slowly began to stop after that, and the negative aura in the room, the small sounds I would have heard in the night, started to stop as well. And when I came back from the Christmas holidays in January, it was barely here. The presents had all but vanished, and it felt like the rest of the dorm rooms in Robinson. Over Christmas, I decided to do a bit of research into Robinson to figure out what could explain what was going on. I found out that Robinson has been a hotel before my boarding school had purchased it, which is why the rooms were so big, and why they still had ensuite bathrooms, and you could actually still see the old wallpaper that had been painted over in some of the rooms. The town where my school is was a really big place for spying and espionage during the Cold War, and it still to this day has strong links to British espionage, and this hotel was very close to places where this would have definitely occurred. The coat I saw matches exactly the kind of coats worn by the Navy during the 1960s. So from what I gathered, and since getting information about the detailed workings of the British government during the 60s is kind of difficult, I like to think that maybe it's the ghosts of someone who lost their life in my room when it was still a hotel during the Cold War, and they're still stuck here, waiting until they can pass on. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be...
sites. David actually walked Doc down this hill to this one little clearing. Doc had a backpack with him full of the tools he used to dig out the different rocks. After David had walked Doc to this spot, David walked back up the hill towards their car and went about 50 yards away from where Doc was to his dig site. And over the next several hours, the two would work independent of one another, just digging for tow paths. Periodically, David would look over and he'd make sure that he could see Doc and make sure Doc was okay. At 3:45 in the afternoon, David decides, all right, it's probably time to get going soon. And he pokes his head up and he looks in the direction of where Doc was supposed to be, and Doc's not there. He had just seen him about 15 minutes earlier, so he's not concerned. He knows it's only been a few minutes, and frankly, Doc can't really go anywhere. He can barely walk. And so he just kind of stands up and maybe tries to get a better look, and he's thinking, okay, maybe Doc stood up and got behind a tree to relieve himself, or maybe he kind of is just out of sight, and he starts walking down to the area to just go find Doc. But Doc isn't there, and neither is his backpack with all of his tools. And David's sitting there thinking, I guess Doc must have packed up and headed back to the car. But then David's thinking to himself, in order to go from this dig site up to the car, it means walking up a fairly steep embankment, and there's no way that Doc would have been able to do that without assistance. So he's looking around the area thinking, is there any sign of something bad happening here? There's no blood, there's no sign of any sort of altercation that would have happened here. David certainly didn't hear anything going on near him. He didn't hear an animal attack or anything like that. So he thinks, okay, somehow he must have got up to the car. David walks up to the bed, goes in the car. Doc's not up there. David goes in the car and he starts honking the horn and yelling out for Doc. No response. As he's honking the horn, 3 motorists come down the road. They see David honking the horn, and so they say, hey, what's going on? David tells them, hey, I got my 84-year-old friend. I don't know where he went. He can't have gone far. Can you guys help me look for him? But after David and these motorists spend a couple of hours looking in this area, and there's no sign of him, they end up calling the authorities. The police show up, and over the next week, there is this extensive search in this whole area that includes bloodhounds and hundreds of people. But despite this massive effort, nothing is ever found of Doc. He just vanishes. And so Doc's wife writes a letter to the governor of Colorado and just says, he can't have done this on his own. He can't have walked away on his own. Someone or something lifted him up and took him away. There was no response to this letter, and ultimately Doc's case was shut down. They stopped looking for him and assumed he had died. But when David Blightus looked into this case and featured the Doc DeMetz case on his documentary, they actually reopened the case. But as of right now, there's no new additional details about the whereabouts of Doc DeMetz. To this day, we don't know what happened to him. In 2014, Jim McGrogan was a 39-year-old medical doctor who was living in Indiana with his wife and his 2 kids. He was widely regarded as a very loving husband and devoted father, and everybody seemed to just love this guy. Jim was in phenomenal shape. He had run marathons, triathlons. He loved being in the outdoors, hiking, rock climbing, snowshoeing, skiing. That was Jim's happy place. And so in early March 2014, Jim decides he wants to plan a trip with some friends to go hiking in Colorado. And so he begins planning out where they're going to go hiking, and he finds this amazing trail right opposite the very famous Vail ski resort. Even though Jim was very competent in the outdoors, he would take a survival class and an avalanche preparedness class before he left for Colorado, just to show his wife that he wasn't taking any chances, that he would be well prepared in case the worst were to happen on this trip. About 2 weeks later, he's in Colorado and he heads to a ski shop where he rents a split snowboard as well as loads up on all the supplies that you might need for being in the outdoors. Early the next day, Jim and his friends arrive at the trailhead. Jim, in his backpack, had his cell phone. He also had an extra cell phone battery. He had a great GPS. In addition, he had loads of food and water. He had his split snowboard. He has his avalanche beacon. He's got extra clothing. I mean, this guy is well outfitted for this trip. So they start on this hike, and by 10 a.m. that morning, the rest of the group is feeling tired and wants to take a break. Jim doesn't want to take a break. He's in amazing shape and he wants to keep going. So he says, hey guys, I'm going to walk just a little bit farther up and I'll meet you at our next planned stop. No one bats an eye because Jim is like this total stud. He knows what he's doing. And they're like, all right, go ahead, we'll see you up there. Once the group is well rested, they stand back up and they keep walking. They get to that first stop and Jim's not there. They think, okay, we were sitting there for a little while. I'm sure he just went to the next planned stop because they had planned stops all along the route. The trail they were on, because it had snowed significantly that winter and lots of people had been on this trail, the The trail itself was totally packed down to the dirt, so it was very easy to identify this trail. Anywhere there wasn't trail was covered in snow, and so if you were walking this trail, it would be really easy to stay on it. Also, if you were to deviate from the trail and start walking away, it would be really obvious because people would see your footprints leaving the trail. But as Jim's friends are making their way up this trail and not seeing Jim at each of these subsequent stops, they don't see any footprints leaving the trail. So they just figure he must have gone all the way to the end. He's just way ahead of us. But by 5 p.m., when they made it all the way up to the top where they planned on stopping and turning around, Jim wasn't there. And they hadn't passed him on the way up, and they hadn't seen any footprints or any ski tracks or anything to indicate that someone had left the path. And so very worried about Jim, they called the authorities. Over the next 5 days, a massive search is launched in this area, including 3 helicopters that scoured an 18-mile square radius. They had sent sniffing dogs out there. They had all these very experienced mountaineers combing the area, but they couldn't find any sign of him. And again, because of all the snow outside of that trail they were on, the helicopter just searched up and down that trail looking for indications that someone had left the trail, looking for those footprints or ski tracks just off that trail they were on, and there weren't any. There was no sign that anyone had left the trail at any point. Yet Jim was gone. The authorities, friends, family, everybody's baffled. But they're thinking to themselves, you know, Jim's a really competent outdoorsman. He has a working GPS, and they checked their cell phones. That whole area they were in, they had cell phone reception. So they're thinking to themselves, we don't know what's going on, but I'm sure he's going to turn up at some point. 20 days after Jim went missing, his body is discovered by 2 hikers 7 kilometers away from the trail he had been on when he went missing. He had died from significant head trauma as well as a broken femur. It looked like he had fallen from a really great height, but it wasn't entirely clear where he had actually fallen from. He was found with just leggings and a shirt on, no jacket and no boots. His boots were nowhere to be found. His backpack was next to him, and inside of it was his GPS that worked and his cell phone that worked. He even had an extra battery for his cell phone. Yet at no point had he tried to use his cell phone over the duration of the time he had been out there. He also had lots of food and water and additional clothing. He had a tent, but it looked like none of it had been touched since he packed it originally. And then strangest of all is there were no footprints or ski tracks leading up to either where he was or any of the surrounding areas. There were no tracks to show how he actually got where he got. It's as if he had been lifted off the trail 7 kilometers away and dropped where he was. When the exact location of where he was found was communicated back to the authorities, the helicopter pilots who had been involved in that initial 5-day search said that we looked at that area multiple times and he wasn't there. So at some point after those 5 days, Jim had found a way to land 7 kilometers away in this random place where there's no footprints that lead to it, no tracks, no anything. We know he had a working cell phone and a working GPS, and we know that he didn't make it to this spot where he ultimately was found. Say that he clearly saw Bobby, recognized that it was time to come back down, it was time for dinner. He clearly saw Bobby turn and start walking down towards the camp, at which point the counselor turned his back on Bobby, and he too began walking down towards the camp, which was not very far away. When the counselor got to the camp and turned back around though, Bobby was gone. And so the counselor starts immediately tracing his steps back to try to find Bobby, but he can't find him anywhere. The counselor goes and gets a number of the other counselors to come help him find Bobby. After about 30 minutes, no sign of Bobby. He's just gone. The camp counselors are looking around thinking, how is this possible? He was literally right there. He started walking. He was right behind me. How could he have gotten lost in such a short amount of time and in an area where he could literally see the camp and was actually on the river that leads right back to the camp? It didn't make any sense. The counselors alerted authorities and this massive search is launched to find Bobby. Over 300 people come out, including people from the military. It's this huge search and nothing is found of this boy. He's completely gone. 10 days after he went missing, they had to call off the search because there was absolutely no sign of this child. Even after the search ended, many of the camp counselors continued to, in their off time, scour the area around the camp to look for Bobby. And a year later, 3 camp counselors would actually find him. 3 camp counselors decided to go to a very hard to access area that had been searched previously, but they felt like it was the one spot that needed a little bit more attention. And it was 5 kilometers west of the camp and almost 800 yards up a fairly steep incline. This is a hard to access area. But they climbed their way up there, and sure enough, even though this area had been searched before, they found Bobby's hearing aid, bits of his clothing, and some of his bones. They didn't find any more of his remains, and no one knows what actually happened to him. But it really makes you wonder, what happened after the camp counselor turned his back on Bobby? It's as if someone...
The crying princess and her little bird friend. But then, in what I thought was a beautiful moment, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Something was moving through the trees about 100 yards up the slope. Something huge. Something that drooled when it saw me sitting on that fallen log. It was a grizzly bear, fresh out of hibernation, and it was obviously starving. What I thought was my little crow friend began its song and dance again, only this time, it was intensely more frenzied than it had been before. I thought it was a warning. I couldn't have been more wrong. The bear began a rapid descent down the slope towards me, panting as it hurtled through the trees. But I was ready for it. I had managed to pick up the most potent bear mace I could get my hands on, one of the things my new Reddit hiking buddies had insisted I purchased. I pulled it out, flipped off the safety catch, and sprayed a huge mist of bright yellow mace into the air in front of me. I was terrified, convinced that it just wouldn't work for some reason, that the bear would just be too hungry, would take the pain and tear me limb from limb right there on the forest floor. But it worked. It actually worked. As soon as the grizzly hit that stinging yellow mist, it stopped dead in its tracks, blinked its eyes before it began to violently sneeze and retch as the mace began to take effect. I didn't bother to stick around and revel in the victory. I mean, who would? I just ran. Ran until my ankle felt like it was about to explode, but thankfully, some small act of God's mercy led me right back to my car. And somehow I actually made it home. I lived to be able to tell this tale. But when I did a little research. And what I thought was my little crow friend, what had seemed like a Disney-style friendship between Beauty and Beast, was anything but that. As it turns out, crows and bears have something of a special relationship. Often upon sighting a wounded or infirm animal, a crow will fly down from a tree and caw like the devil. Not out of any kind of concern, but in order to direct a large predator, often a bear, onto the wounded creature. Once the bear had finished chowing down, the crow can eat the scraps. And that day in the woods could have very well ended with me being the scraps. Every summer for the past few years, a group of friends and I have traveled from our homes in Liverpool in the UK to Dumfries and Galloway in Scotland. Dumfries in Galloway is home to the largest continuous forest in the whole of the United Kingdom, Galloway Forest Park. It's about as wild as it gets for the UK, with some parts of the woods being so dense and overgrown that it's clear no one has stepped foot in them for hundreds, possibly thousands of years. Our yearly visits brought us peace, clarity, and a respect for nature, but last year's trip ended in one of the most horrifying and distressing incidents of my entire life. One that completely changed the way I see the world and the way I consider the human mind. Year in, year out, we'd take an overnight coach up across the border, then hike out to a place called Loch Aber. The loch is a private fishing lake supposedly reserved for members of a local fishing club who ensure that the waters are chock full of fish for them to catch, which makes it oh so easy for us to pull a quick in-and-out raid to catch enough of the small rufflefish for our dinner. I'm serious. 45 minutes and we're golden. And take it from any fisherman, that is lightning speed for a half-decent catch. But last year we decided we were tired of the same old digs and set our gazes further afield. A map told us that there was a similarly deep loch about 30 miles east known as Loch D. We figured it would be a perfect fishing spot, and we were right. Sure, it wasn't as quick fire as the private members' lake, but it came with considerably less guilt. Everything was going perfect. That was until the second night when, in the middle of a campfire drinking session, one of my buddies jumped out of his seat and recoiled from the fire. "Who was that?" he asked, sort of calmly at first, nothing more than cautious confusion. "Who's who?" Someone replies lazily. "Someone moving through the trees back there." He was pointing into the trees directly behind my back. I actually gave a hoot of sarcastic laughter at first, thinking he was just trying to scare us. But the moment it became obvious that he wasn't messing around, a jolt of fear went through me and I too leapt out of my seat, spun around, and shone my torch into the darkness. You could feel the tension among us rising as we desperately looked around for who he might have been talking about. Torch beams darted across the trees, inspecting every trunk or thicket of bushes, but there was nothing. No sign of the person my friend had seen. "Hello?" Someone called out, immediately shushed by the rest of us. No one wanted to give away our position, but at the same time, we needed to know if there was anyone out there watching us. But again, nothing. Just silence. "I think you've had a bit too much to drink, mate," I remember saying to the guy who supposedly seen a figure walking through the trees. "I'm fine. I barely touched that Bell's I bought. I swear to God I saw someone just then." "Like who?" someone asked. "Man, woman, young, old, what?" I don't know," he replied shakily. "But they were really, really big. Only big thing around here is your bloody imagination, mate. Now go and get your head down. It's been a long day." And it had, thanks to the overnight coach. No one really sleeps on the journey up to Scotland. I mean, they close their eyes, put some chill music through their earphones, but they never really sleep. So everyone ends up being pretty wrecked by the end of the first night. The next morning, we felt even worse. The first night after such a long journey is usually the one where we sleep like the dead, but not that night. None of us could quite relax, not with the possibility of having someone stalking us in the back of our minds. Thank God we were only planning to fish that day, as we really were not in the mood for anything else, given how bloody exhausted we were. After breakfast, we marched down to the loch with our fishing gear. It's a gorgeous area, a crisp blue lake ringed by hills. It's not unusual to get some really nice sunny days up in Scotland too, especially during the summer. But that day, the sky was this horrible, grimy gray, like the sun had barely risen at all. I was tired, half soaked from the drizzle, barely even excited to be fishing for my dinner. I actually hoped for something exciting to happen, and for my sins, my wish came true. "Look," one of us shouted. "Over there, other side of the loch. Jesus, can you see that thing?" It was the same lad that had seen someone or something walking through the trees. "Where?" We were terrified. One sighting could have been his eyes playing tricks on him. Another couldn't possibly be a mistake. "There," he said, pointing. "Just on the other side. It came out of the trees for a moment, then disappeared. Please tell me you saw that." "Mate, just calm down. It's probably just... I know what I saw. And we need to get out of these fishing gear in a panic." I remember him rushing off back to the camp, one of the lads following him, still trying to calm him down. But it was impossible. He was manic, scared half to death by whatever had briefly emerged from the woods on the other side of the loch. I asked the other boys if they had seen anything, and each shook their heads. None of us had any idea what he was talking about. But that didn't mean they weren't just as freaked out over his outburst. We were supposed to stay for 7 full nights, but that second one was our last. We had managed to talk the lad who was panicking down, convince him to stay a few nights more at the very least. We'd come all this way, and I wasn't about to let one of us just leave because they had a wee scare or something. But it didn't end there either. In the middle of the night, the lad that had been seeing something burst out of his tent, waking each of us before asking, "Can you hear that?" There was silence. Dead silence. I mean, I strained my ears trying to hear what had him so spooked. I heard nothing, just the rustling of a few sleeping bags as confused bloke sat up awake. He was scratching at his own ears, gritting his teeth, rocking back and forth in the dirt as the sound seemed to completely overwhelm him. Next, the exact moment I realized, I think the same moment everyone else picked up on it too, but there was no noise. There was no monster. It was all in his head. He was experiencing a psychotic breakdown, and it was literally all in his head. I feel like what I'm about to read is a warning. I beg you, I implore you, please do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I know those woods like the back of my hand. I was playing with my little brother among those trees when I was still in single-digit ages. So trust me when I say that something has been changing out there, and not for the better. I first noticed something was horribly wrong during a hike a few weeks back. In the early spring, birds migrate back from the warmer southern climates to their northern territories en masse. Thousands upon thousands of tiny songbirds occupy the trees around Mount Greylock during the month of March, each singing a sweet, chirpy song that is in reality a bellowed war cry, a call for challengers to step up and knock them off their perch. Yet as I trudged through the previous winter's leaf litter, I couldn't hear a single thing. No birds, or any other animals for that matter, seemed to still call the forest home. This made me nervous for two reasons. One, animals have an uncanny ability to detect danger that are imperceptible to humans. Their sense of smell, hearing, and general atmospherics are far superior to our own. If the wildlife had fled the area in such a hurry, or at least refused to return, that could mean something awful was about to happen. And two, areas of woodland turn exceptionally quiet when there was a large predator around. Wood pitches would become deathly quiet and still, hoping a black bear or mountain lion would just pass them by. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but either way, it would be hideously unsafe of me to wander around while one was prowling the area. So naturally, I started making my way back towards my car when something real peculiar happened. I feel I should remind you at this point that I've been playing in the woods around Mount Greylock since I was like 7 or 8 years old. It's pretty far from where our family lived when I was a kid, but thanks to our bikes, we had a pretty large area to roam when it came to those long summer breaks. Point being, I know those woods really well, but some way, somehow, I managed to get lost. It first came to my attention that I managed to get myself turned around when I felt my head begin to throb with a dull ache. I stopped walking for a moment, rubbing my eyes and the bridge of my nose to try and massage away the headache. But when I opened my eyes again and looked around, I felt a faint flash of panic running through me. I didn't recognize my surroundings, and I cannot understate how jarring that was for me, to be somewhere I'd been visiting all my life, only for it to feel utterly foreign to me. I actually had to take a moment to take out my compass, just to try and get a bearing of where I was headed. But to my surprise, the compass needle kept slowly moving around. Even when I got it to sit still on a supposed bearing, it slowly began creeping around again. Now this was much less of a problem than it might appear. Sure, it was unnerving, but there are ways around a faulty compass. Like for one, moss mostly grows on the north side of a tree, the side that gets the most sunlight, so that provides an easy way of determining which way was north. At least it usually would. Because as I inspected various tree trunks, I realized the sun was hanging in the southern portion of the sky. That or the moss in this area grew mostly on the southern section of the tree trunks. I get that it's not entirely out of the question, but that was yet another detail that just seemed to fry my brain. Nothing made sense, and the less it did, the more the feeling of pure panic began to bubble in my chest. But the panic in that situation, in any kind of situation, is to welcome defeat, degradation, and death. I kept myself was almost sure the nearest highway was. It was then I came across something I'd never, ever seen in those woods before. Something that seemed so out of place that it was frankly terrifying. In all the years I'd spent roaming those woods with my brother as a kid, I'd never seen anything like the old run-down cabin that stood before me. And I mean it was old, as in there was no way it could have been built any later than like 1979. So just how me and my brother had missed this place was utterly beyond me. The obvious thing to do was to knock on the cabin door, see if anybody was home, and, as much as I might find it humiliating, ask for directions. But as I walked closer and closer towards the rustic front door, I felt the most unusual sensation. I put it down to general tiredness, maybe my blood sugar was low, I'm not entirely sure. But for whatever reason, each footstep that took me closer to the cabin seemed more and more difficult. By the time I was actually bringing a closed fist to knock on that old wooden door, it felt like something was physically repelling me from it, whispering directly into my brain, "Leave this place and never return. Don't look back. Never look back." When I finally knocked, the door creaked open slightly, revealing the dilapidation behind it. Whatever bolts or locks that were on the door had long since worn away, and the inside was just as run down and rotten as the outside was. It was evidently abandoned, but there was a curious order to the furniture that led me to believe that every so often, the cabin did actually receive some visitors aside from me. But something in the corner of the cabin drew my attention. I then saw what it was. What I'm about to attempt to describe is, quite frankly, indescribable. I know it was a wooden idol of some kind, a small statuette set atop of a stone altar. But, and I appreciate that this is intensely confusing to read, I could not make sense of what I was looking at. It was like my brain was completely incapable of computing the information my eyes were feeding it. And with that, my headache returned again, along with the kind of anxiety so crushing that I felt like I was going to have a panic attack. Don't ask me how I know, but that wooden idol, a mess of twigs and vines and moss, was a representation of pure, unfiltered evil. And I ran from it. I'm not in the least bit ashamed to admit that I ran like a scared child from that cabin and into the night. The night. You read that right. When I walked into that cabin, it was still daylight. I couldn't have been there for more than a couple of minutes at least, and that's what it felt like. Only when I burst through the wooden door, it was pitch black outside. I ran until I found the highway, ran until I found my car, and I drove like a madman until I was completely back at home. I haven't been able to bring myself to talk about what happened to me that day until now. I tried to tell a hunting buddy of mine once, but the words just wouldn't seem to come out. But please, heed my warning, and don't go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Mount Fuji is one of the highest volcanoes in all of Asia, and happens to be one of the most sacred sites in all of Japan. The mountain is a cultural icon, and on a clear day, those busying themselves with work or home life in the capital of Tokyo are able to see the mountain's exceptionally symmetrical snow-capped peaks in the far distance. Mount Fuji is a regular fixture in art and photographs, being one of the most common scenes depicted on Japanese postcards, thousands of which are sent all around the world from Japan each year. But on the northwestern side of Mount Fuji, set onto 30 square kilometers of hardened lava, lies a forest known as Akigahara. The Akigahara forest, sometimes known as the Sea of Trees, can be extremely dense in places, with the porous lava rock red of the forest having properties which make it adept at absorbing sound waves. This can give visitors a sense of absolute solitude, making it a popular destination for other less savory activities such as hiking or camping. You see, the Akigahara has a historical reputation in Japan for being home of the Yurai, a name given to the ghosts of the dead in Japanese mythology. This is down to a number of reasons, but the most prevalent is the fact that the Akigahara is known quite bluntly as a forest in which people take their lives. Every year, scores of Japanese men and women venture into the forest to end their lives. These incidents have become too frequent over the past 50 years or so that Japanese authorities have placed signs at the head of some trails urging visitors to think of their families and to contact prevention hotlines. In 2003 alone, over 100 bodies were located in the Akigahara, an increase from the previous year's 78. During the year 2010, Japanese police noted that more than 200 people have attempted to end their lives in the forest, with just over 50 of them having completed the morbid act, undeterred by the many signs and warnings given to those who venture out there. Perhaps the most common method in the deep woods near Mount Fuji are overdoses or hanging, although many more creative methods have been observed by the annual body searches conducted by police, volunteers, and journalists. It is also morbidly interesting to note that the rate in which this happens in Japan increases during the month of March, being the end of the fiscal year for Japanese businesses and traders. So much so that in recent years, local officials have had a huge effort to stop publicizing the numbers and figures in an attempt to curb the Akigahara's popularity as a destination for this kind of act. The site's popularity has often been attributed to Saiko Matsumoto's 1961 novel Nami no To, known in English as The Tower of Waves. The novel is the story of a Japanese couple who, on discovering that fate has rendered it impossible for them to be together happy, take a trip into the deep woods near Mount Fuji, wherein they end their lives together. It is still considered one of the most romantic novels ever published on the Japanese market, but the blame for the deaths in the Akigahara cannot be placed squarely at the feet of Mr. Matsumoto, for there is another book, written by the author Wataru Tsurumi, that details the hardness of living in Japanese society. It is known as Kanzen Jisatsu Manuraru, or the complete manual of ending your life. First published on July 4th, 1993, the book went on to sell more than 1 million copies in the Japanese domestic literature market alone. In the postscript, Tsurumi says, "To think that at the worst crucial moment one can escape from the pain by ending their own life, one can live for the moment easier." So by distributing this book, I want to make this stifling society an easier place to live in. This is the aim of this book, and I never intend to encourage readers to end their own life. Although the book is quite clearly an instruction manual, the author explains his philosophy throughout in opposition to the social pressure to live strong. He details every method, rating different aspects of each technique, such as painfulness, gruesomeness of the body, probability of failure, and cost in event of failure. The fact that one can easily identify the least painful and easiest method of such is and was extremely controversial at the time of publication. However, the history of ending your own life in Akigahara predates both novels' publication, and the place has long been associated with death. For example, there is a practice in Japan known as ubatsute, which literally translates to abandoning an old woman, whereby an infirm or elderly relative was carried to a mountain or some other remote, desolate place and left there to die. Despite being an ancient or archaic practice, abandoning of the elderly was practiced in Japan well into the 19th century, long after other cultures had abandoned it in favor of the elongation of life, palliative care, or general comfort and respect for the elderly. It is this that primarily led Akigahara to be thought of as haunted by the Yurai of those left to die there. However, despite local authorities' efforts to curtail interest in the forest, fairly recent events have brought public attention back towards it in a huge way. All thanks to a YouTuber by the name of Logan Paul. The Ohio native faced a huge online backlash over a YouTube video he posted during a visit to Japan, one of which showed the body of apparently a victim of someone who took their own life. The vlog-style post entailed Logan with his friends heading into the forest to film the so-called haunted woods. There they came across a man's body. It is clear that they were incredibly shocked by what they saw before them, with a couple of screenshots of Logan's expression being the mainstay of video thumbnails. But outrage was widespread when Paul and his accompaniment began to apparently make jokes, making light of an incredibly dark situation and inviting a torrent of criticism. Paul's channels were removed from YouTube's Google Preferred program, where brands sell ads on the platform's top 5% of content creators. It hadn't gotten completely dark yet, but the shapes I noticed approaching me were unidentifiable. As they grew closer, I could make out the shape of two dogs walking slowly down the shore. I figured they belonged to another camper and called out to let them know I was there. As the seconds passed, no answer came, and the dogs continued to get closer. While I'm not, nor have ever I been afraid of dogs, I do practice common sense and join the other two on the bank. My caution was beginning to shift into fear. Odds are that if a group of dogs form a pack without the moderating influence of a human, they become feral and can be a serious danger to any person they come in contact with. I was that person on this night, and things freaked me out. During this whole interaction, they began attacking me. Each of the leaders had grabbed me, one on the hand and the other had a mouthful of my leg. The rest had ganged up and took a firm grip on my right leg. This wasn't some rough play either. I could tell that they were trying to pull me down to the ground.